welcome AAS President Dr. Karl Bilimoria and Founders Lecture Presenter Dr. Toby Cosgrove.
All right, well, can we get the slides on the outer screens, please? Thank you, there we go. All right, so they're not quite ferns, but we decided to do, instead of a fireside chat between two ferns. Now, if you've seen this show before, you have, if you haven't seen it before, this is sort of what it looks like. It's a low-budget set. We will not have any water spilling on Dr. Cosgrove today, as has been the case, but and commonly we have misspellings, so we didn't actually misspell your name here, but Dr. Cosgrove. But we're thrilled to welcome you, Dr. Cosgrove. He's the former president and chief executive officer of Cleveland Clinic, and he currently serves as an executive advisor for the health system. He has spoken all over the world, including Davos. He's on TV and media and print all the time, and so we're really thrilled that you joined us here today. He's received a number of awards. He received the Woodrow Wilson Center Award for Public Service and the Harvard Business School Alumni Award. There are many, many, many others. He's also, always listed as one of the 100 most influential people in healthcare. We're thrilled to have you. He's a former surgeon, and we'd like to get started just with, tell us about where you got started and how you got into surgery, and what were some of the challenges you faced early on?
Well, thank you very much for having me here. This is a distinguished group, and I can't tell you how long it's taken me to get here. I applied to this group 35 years ago and was rejected, so I'm...
Sorry about that. We're a little different now.
Well, thank you. You're very ecumenical. Thank you for having me. So I grew up in a place called Watertown, New York, which is frequently described as being 350 miles north of the main channel of thought. As a kid, I had a very famous surgeon who had a house, a summer house near ours, and in his boathouse, he had all these pictures of him in the operating room. And I, at 10 years old, decided I wanted to be a cardiac surgeon because I thought I'd look good in a mask. Not a cardiac surgeon, I decided I wanted to be a surgeon. So that led me to Williams College, where I was a total disaster, and then on to the University of Virginia, which was the only medical school which accepted me out of about 13 tries. At that point, cardiac surgery was really in its infancy. For excitement, we used to go and watch from the dome the cardiac surgery, and frequently the pump would explode and things like that would happen. Those were pretty exciting. So from there, I ultimately spent 2 years at Strong Memorial in Rochester, New York, with a surgical internship and a surgical residency. And then at that time, the Vietnam War was in full swing, and all of us graduating from medical school were commissioned. And so I went to Vietnam right after 2 years of training as a partially trained surgeon, and actually ran a 100-bed hospital, which was called a casualty staging flight. And what happened was, in Vietnam, you got hit, you would be taken to a tent hospital. There your bleeding would be stopped and you would be splinted, and then you would be moved to Saigon or Da Nang, where they had all the specialty hospitals. And then you would be evacuated, so all the hospitals would then send their patients to the Air Force base, and we would take care of them for 24 hours and then put them on airplanes, and they would go to Guam, Philippines, Japan, for the next step on their evacuation. There was 2 doctors, so we were on every other night, about 13 or 15 nurses, and a score of corpsmen. And during that time, we evacuated 22,000 sick and wounded through that facility. I came out of that and somehow got an inflated idea of myself, thinking of myself as a fighter pilot or something, and applied to several residencies, talked my way into Massachusetts General Hospital, by sitting in the chairman of the Department of Surgery's office until he'd see me. And had the good fortune, then went through that residency program. Was farmed out for a year because they didn't have room for me to London, and then came back, finished my residency. This is a sort of a sad story of a guy who flunked up, and you have to be careful how you say that. In my residency, they sort of told me that I was the worst. I was they told me I was one of 13 guys, and the last one of 13 guys in my residency. And I could do anything, but I could not be the chief resident in cardiac surgery. So they got my brother-in-law, current brother-in-law, and promoted him a year ahead, and got him out of his military service, and made him chief resident and sent me on my way. When I finished, I did 6 months as chief resident at Boston Children's Hospital, and then I was unemployed for the next 6 months.
What'd you do while you were unemployed?
I wrote a little book on infants and cardiac surgery. At that point, there was nothing that really told you about the drugs that you used, how you set the ventilators, all that sort of thing. And so I wrote a little manual during that time that would be a handbook for people looking after kids in the perioperative period.
How'd you end up in Cleveland?
Well, I was unemployed, and
Not that there's anything wrong with that, but
nothing. Well, there was some. It was getting a little hungry. There was no salary, and things were a little thin. I got a letter in the mail one day from Fred Loop, who had just become the chief of cardiac surgery there, asking me if I would be interested in a job there. And I remember, and for those of you not familiar with it, about 15 years previously, the Cleveland Clinic had done the first coronary angiogram. And then 5 years after that, they'd done the first coronary bypass. And so at that point, they were doing about 3,000 heart operations a year. And I had an opportunity to be one of 5 individuals doing that. And so I jumped on it and took my U-Haul truck, drove it to Cleveland, slept my first night in Cleveland in the truck, and eventually learned how to do heart surgery.
And what's the pathway for a surgeon look like? What did you do over time that led to this role of becoming the CEO of one of the major health institutions of the world?
Well, one of the things that I did was I was operating like crazy. And at that point, you could do as much as you could stand. So I remember my first year, I did, I think, 500 heart operations, and over the next 30 years, I did 22,000. And I got interested at that along the way, and everybody, I went there probably doing 2,800 coronaries and maybe 200 valves. And I became interested in valve surgery and got involved with various industries that were developing new valves. And over time, I began to try and figure out what I could do better. There were the things that used to frustrate me. I remember putting a purse string suture in around the atrial appendage to put cannulas in. So I wound up, at that time, there was a clamp that you put in and went zip, zip like this, and a purse string. So, I tried to, automate that, and then changed cannulas, changed the way we ran the heart-lung machine, and changed the blood. And so I was constantly pushing to try and make the things better, and working with people, and particularly working with companies to try and make the products that we use in surgery and the techniques that we use in surgery better. Interestingly, sort of an aside, when I was at Boston Children's Hospital as a medical student, in one day we lost 5 kids in cardiac surgery. You can imagine what it was like going back the next day to try and do it again. When I was at Mass General as a resident, mortality rate approached double digits. And then towards the end of, and so all of our efforts were trying to make the cutting and the sewing and the care of patients better. And now mortality rates 1% or less for very sick patients, and that has been a constant evolution of that. You know, you and I were talking earlier, and this is one of the things that was interesting. Along the way, we used to go and visit other surgeons places. I'd hear somebody who's doing something interesting in someplace else in the world, and I'd get on an airplane, take my little pad, and go watch them, stand over their shoulders. And I probably did 20 different trips over time. I went to Stanford and Texas Heart and London and France and Germany and Mass General and Boston Children's, and any place I could go, I heard somebody was doing something, and I would bring it back and try and adopt it to making things better. And over time, it really changed the course of cardiac surgery, both at our institution and frankly around the United States. And in that process, I thought, what a great thing to be able to do that. They gave me that opportunity to go and learn other places. And so when I became CEO of the Cleveland Clinic, I said, well, I want all of you to go and take a trip once a year, and we'll pay for it. I don't care where you go watch the assembly line at General Motors, go learn something, bring it back. And I thought, this is a great idea. You've got 2,000 spies out sucking up everybody's, because, you know, frankly, regardless of how good you are, there's somebody someplace in the world that's doing something better than you are.
That's great.
But I couldn't get them to do it.
No. Why?
I'm not sure why. I think some of it was arrogance. I think some of it was self-satisfaction. I think some of it was just status quo.
Yeah.
We're big on status quo and healthcare.
Yeah. So when you, what were the steps that got you to the CEO? Was that something that you were looking to do? Were you selected? And what was the preparation like that you had to get there?
Well, so I was 30 years as a cardiac surgeon, and first 15 years I was staff surgeon at the Cleveland Clinic. And then I became chief of thoracic and cardiovascular surgery at the Cleveland Clinic for the next 15 years. And then, you know, I was coming up on 64 years old. And along the way, my predecessor had asked me to start a venture capital company for the Cleveland Clinic. I didn't know anything about venture capital. I had to go home and look up what it meant. I got people to help me, and I think the reason you asked, because I'd been involved with industry along the way and developed a bunch of products, et cetera. And so I thought I would just hang up my spikes and go out to California and continue a venture capital career, or try and worm my way into a venture capital company. And what happened was, all of a sudden, Fred Loop announced he was going to retire, and asked to throw my hat in the ring. And I didn't have any inkling that I was going to be the opportunity to come be CEO. So that was in January, and then I decided, okay, if I'm going to seriously consider doing this, I better whip myself into shape. So I'd operate all day long, and then I'd go home and go in my study and, you know, essentially read and until my head went down on the desk, and think about what I was going to do, what I thought the opportunities were, what I needed to know. And then I was selected in, I guess, in May or June, and didn't take over as CEO until October. So during that time, I continued my study. And I arrived in mid-October and totally unprepared. In fact, I'll give you a special hint. You know those parentheses on P&Ls? It took me a couple of years to learn this, but those aren't good.
Yeah.
That's how sophisticated I was. I'd never gone to business school, nothing. And so then the process of trying to learn became intense. I have a friend that was a social friend by the name of Michael Porter, who is a very distinguished professor at the Harvard Business School. So I called him up and I said, help, what's a CEO do? So he said, well, come on up. So I went up to Boston, went in his office, he closed the door, and he started grilling me. And for 2 hours, he was there asking me questions about healthcare, taking notes like crazy. And I thought, I was coming here to learn from you, what's going on here? It turns out he was writing his book on healthcare. And out of that, we established a relationship. They went back and forth. I'd go up when he was doing a case study on the Cleveland Clinic and talk, and he'd come to Cleveland and talk, and we went back and forth for a number of years, sort of on an annual basis. So I learned from him, and I had a bunch of friends at GE, and Jack Welch helped me a little bit, and some other people. Some people that were head of 3M, CEO there helped me, and I went and essentially tried to learn from anybody I could. I read like crazy about leadership to the point where my wife finally asked me, haven't you read enough about leadership? So it was a self-education process. And from that, I learned, frankly, I was totally unprepared. And I thought it was unfair to me, and I thought it was unfair to the Cleveland Clinic to send somebody who was so unprepared. I mean, what happened was, all of a sudden, instead of reading the New England Journal, I was reading the Harvard Business Review. Instead of being in the operating room, I was in the boardroom. Instead of talking to patients and doctors, I was talking to members of the board. And all of a sudden, I became a public figure. I mean, we used to go to cocktail parties in Cleveland, and nobody knew who the hell I was because I'd been in the operating room all day, every day, and I'd be introduced as Anita Cosgrove's husband, which was a distinction, but nonetheless, I didn't have any public persona myself. And all of a sudden, I'm a public figure. In fact, I'll tell you one more embarrassing things that happened. The local newspaper, the Plain Dealer, came to interview me. And they found out about the fact that I was dyslexic and that I had a terrible academic record, etc. So the front page of the paper headlines were, C's and D's to CEO. Welcome to the NFL. Great.
When did you stop operating?
I operated for a year after I became CEO because I had a huge waiting list, and I wanted to sort of get rid of that, but I realized fairly quickly that I couldn't be in the operating room thinking about the budget, and I couldn't be in the boardroom thinking about my patients, and I wasn't doing justice to either one of them, so I quit. Just bang, that was it.
So one of the things that we're interested this year in doing for the Association for Academic Surgery is sort of fostering this phenotype of surgeons who want to become health system leaders. And you noted that you wanted to make sure that that never happened again in Cleveland, and so you developed the Leadership Academy. Can you tell us about how you did that and what you were focused on?
Yeah, let me go back a little bit in my thinking. First of all, as I looked at it, I think that leadership is a combination of a whole lot of different things. And all of you, frankly, we're all docs, we're all trained to be technicians. Just because you're a great gastroenterologist doesn't mean you're going to be a great leader. They're two entirely different sets of capabilities. One is you can be a great surgeon and get amazing results and writes thousands of papers. That doesn't qualify to lead people. And so what I said was, look, let's start giving people opportunities to have leadership positions. So we started and made the president of all of our hospitals a doc. And interestingly, what we saw was some did well, some didn't do well, some liked it, some didn't like it. And now we have about 250, 300 doctors who are in some sort of leadership position at the clinic. And then I began to think more seriously about, okay, how do you really think about how you develop leadership? And I thought there must be organizations out there that have done this and done this well for a long period of time. So I tried to think about who they were. And you know, at the end of the day, the military has been developing leaders forever. And they have a very systematic way that they go about doing it. And the product that comes out the other end is pretty terrific. I mean, you don't have to talk to too many 4-star or 3-star generals to realize that these guys are sharp. And so what they do is they start out and you get to lead a small group of people. And if you do well, you get a bigger group of people. And if you do well there, you get a bigger group of people. And in between, they send you to school. And they send you to Naval War College, or they send you to Harvard, or they send you to school all over the place. So it's a combination of practical experience and the intellectual exercise that goes with it. So we were doing the practical aspect of it, and we had to add the intellectual part. And by the way, I think that one of the things that I was not a big believer in leadership when I started the CEO job. In fact, I didn't think about it really at all. And then I began to notice that if you change the leadership of a nursing floor that was having problems and put a different head nurse in, the place changed like that. I mean, it was about 2 weeks the place had changed. And if you change department chairs, that one was having trouble, and you put somebody else in, the place changed. And I saw the same thing with hospitals. I sent one of our orthopedic surgeons to be president of a hospital. It was struggling, and all of a sudden this place has blossomed. So suddenly I said, okay, there is something to this leadership stuff. It's important. And it seems that each organization, each part of an organization, takes on the persona of the leader. And leaders people watch leaders. I mean, they watch how you walk, they watch how you dress, they watch how you talk, they watch you and they take their cues from you. So all of a sudden I became pretty interested in trying to develop leaders. And so we developed, and by the way, I think this goes on at every area. Mm-hmm. So we started what we call Leadership Academy, and that is to begin to, on a regular basis, evaluate leaders, give them opportunities to get the intellectual capabilities that go along with leadership. And basically, so let me divert and say something that's probably going to get you all upset, but I'm leaving here fast so I won't get hurt. I think academic medicine has not been very good at selecting leaders. We really don't do much by way of preparing leaders. How many institutions, that's the weight of your CV and the number of papers that you've written, get you selected to be a leader? And I would suggest that writing a paper has nothing to do with your leadership. It's an exercise in your intellect, which I think all of you have got adequate intellect because you've gotten here through medical school, et cetera. And it is an exercise in your a different thing than is leadership. And basically, leadership is about people, and it's people skills. And that, being a colonoscopist or being a great author, getting a grant doesn't have anything to do necessarily with your ability to lead. And a lot of leadership is about empathy. And the question really is, can you teach empathy? It's interesting that there's quite an intellectual body of literature about teaching empathy, and to sum it all up, I would say that you probably can teach empathy, but it's probably taught best in the sandbox. And the older that you get, the harder it is to teach somebody to be empathetic. And if you get to be 50, 55, I think you're probably not going to learn empathy. But that, I think, is in communication are really two of the important aspects of leadership. And we don't select for that. We don't train for that. And I think it's incredibly important for us as our future as a profession to have leaders who understand that and are willing to take that responsibility that goes with leadership.
Were there things about you as a surgeon that made you a good leader? There are a lot of things you think that were probably not there, but what about us might make us good leaders?
Well, first of all, you assume that I was a good leader. That's open for debate. A lot of people think my first name is Goddamn. I would go back a little further, actually, in terms of that. You know, it turns out that I didn't know this, but it turns out that I'm dyslexic, and I didn't know it till I was 34 years old. I never heard the word. But one thing that came away from dyslexia was the fact that in order to get through college and through medical school, I had to work a lot harder than everybody else did. Basically because I couldn't read. And I think that taught persistence. And I think that is an important part of leadership, because the first time you say something in a leader, not everybody stands up and salutes and marches off in the same direction with you. It does take consistent, repetitive efforts to get people to go along.
So one of the things I found interesting was that you turned down President Obama to be the VA secretary, and was curious why that was, and he already told me he's willing to talk about it. I'm not just putting him on the spot, okay? No.
Yeah. So I'm sure many of you don't remember this, but there was a crisis in the VA that came from waiting lists. And the head of the secretary of the VA got fired, and I got a call on a Saturday saying would I consider the job as secretary of the VA. I hadn't even thought about the VA, ever. And then I got a call on Sunday night saying the president would like to call you tomorrow. And on Monday morning, the president called me and asked me if I would come to Washington and consider and meet with people and consider being head of the VA. I went, I found out a little bit about the VA. First of all, there's 165 hospitals. There are 360,000 employees. The budget's $180 billion a year. And they needed a major change in culture, and there were 18 months left in the Obama's administration. And I knew how long it had taken me at the Cleveland Clinic to make a change in the culture of the Cleveland Clinic, which was at that time maybe 40,000 caregivers. And I didn't think there was any chance in 18 months that I could make a major difference in the VA in that period of time. So I wrote him on that Sunday. I sat down and wrote him a week later, wrote him a letter and said, I'm very sorry that I'm very sympathetic to veterans, and I'll do anything I can to help the VA, but I can't take this job. That was a mistake. So they say no good deed goes unpunished. They then put me on a commission on care to study the VA and make recommendations on where the VA should go from there. And for 10 months, I went from Cleveland to Washington, back and forth, studying the VA. And we made our recommendations. So that was the first chapter in that saga.
So if you went back and did it again, would you have taken the position?
No.
No. Okay. Just checking. But you did take a position in 2016 on an economic council with Trump.
I had another bite at the apple with the VA.
Oh, okay.
I got a call from when Trump was the president-elect, asking me to come to Mar-a-Lago to meet with him, and he wanted me to be the secretary for the VA. So I went. By this time, I knew a lot about the VA. I'd spent 10 months in deep study about the VA, and I had come to the conclusion, again, this is probably heresy, but I'll go ahead and say it. I'd come to the conclusion that I didn't think that the VA, well, let me tell you a few things about the VA. It has 130 versions of the electronic medical record. There's no common purchasing. The average age of the building is 50 years old. They had no leadership development. They had very poor HR. I also found out that the VA has 3 branches. It has the clinical branch, which is about 90% of the VA employees. It has the benefits, and the area that I thought I could do the best in was it runs cemeteries. I thought I could probably manage that okay, with very few complaints. And I thought that probably, then I also realized that the VA is the only, and the Indian Health Service are the only 2 services that the federal government provides directly to our citizens. They pay for a lot of things, but as far as delivering the service, they're the only ones that do it. The post office is going increasingly private, et cetera. So I thought that probably the best thing to do for veterans was to give them choice and allow them to go to the private sector or go to the VA. I thought it would be good for the VA because they would then have to compete. Right. I also thought it would be good for the veterans because it would give them more options. If you stop and think, 165 hospitals, that averages 3 to state. It'd be pretty hard. I mean, in the state of Ohio, there are 200 hospitals. 3 VA hospitals is really not enough to cover the whole state. So I thought it would be good for veterans. I thought it'd be good for the VA. And so I took this seriously, this opportunity to think about it. And then I called a lot of members of the Senate and the House of Representatives and people that would begin to change that law. And I came to the conclusion that there was not an appetite for making that sort of change. And so I said, thank you very much, but I don't think I could do that. And then to your question, the president, when he first became president, put together a couple of advisory boards. And one of them was that I was asked to sit on. I was the only representative of healthcare, which I thought was an enormous responsibility because here we are, 1/5 of the U.S. economy. And so We had a couple of meetings. The president we sat around the table, maybe 20 of us. The president was very respectful. People were very candid in their discussion they went all the way from wages to employment to healthcare, et cetera. And then what happened was Charlottesville happened. And essentially the entire committee resigned in protest to the incidents in Charlottesville. And that was at the end of we sent a letter to the president saying that we thought we would resign because of this, and he announced that he had disbanded us.
Okay, it's probably not all bad.
We were trumped.
Yeah. And now you've taken an executive advisor role at Google. Tell us about what you're working on there.
Well, so I could be glib and say I'm teaching him the code, but then I'd have to be Morse code.
Yeah.
That's not my thing. So I am very impressed as I went further and further along about the explosion in knowledge that you all are faced with. For example, there are 5,800 medical journals putting out over 800,000 articles a year. The total amount of data in the human genome is 3 billion base pairs. There is the total of all the data in the world, 1/3 of it is healthcare data. And that data is now doubling every 73 days. We are swimming in data. A, that's the problem, and B, that's the opportunity. And as I saw this, I thought that there was enormous opportunity but things, first of all, we had to store the data, organize the data, and have access to the data in a secure way. And the way we're doing it right now is the Cleveland Clinic has a data center. And, there are a huge number of data centers, a section with hospitals across the country. And I'll bet you I can walk into that data center myself and take a server off the shelf the security is not, and if that's true of the Cleveland Clinic, I can't imagine what it's like in the House of Good Samaritan, Watertown, New York. And to be honest with you, storing healthcare data is not our expertise. So I thought that information is going to have to be secure, and you've seen MedStar get shut down in Washington. You've seen by being hacked. You've seen hospitals in London hacked and shut down. And you've seen the city of Baltimore hacked and shut down. And so there's no question in my mind that data is more secure in the cloud than it is in your local data center. So that was the first thing that, and there's another advantage that goes with storing your data in the cloud, and that is the issue of interoperability. We've struggled with interoperability with electronic medical records forever, and it hasn't come to pass. And about a year and a half ago, all the major tech companies came together in the White House, and they agreed that they would share data across clouds with permission. Now that's interoperability for the first time. So I don't think we have the ability to be secure, and we don't have the interoperability, and I think the cloud brings us those. Now, the second part of this data is it's an enormous opportunity to learn from the data. And let me give you just a couple of, one example. Recently learned that Optum has 1 million patients that have the diagnosis of aortic stenosis. They know the treatment, they know the outcome, they know the cost, and can you imagine what that we could learn from that about the indications of when to intervene in that disease set and what would be the best outcomes, the most cost-effective, et cetera, that, from a huge data set, you're learning using machine learning. So I think that those data sets can be infinitely helpful for us in terms of just learning. And then it comes in two other sections about how they can help us. They can help us clinically, and many of you probably know about DeepMind in London. So DeepMind is a company that worked with Moorfield, and they did, which is the eye hospital in London, which does the retinal scans. And from that, they can tell your age, sex, and blood pressure from a retinal scan autonomously and make 60 diagnoses from it. Now, you stop and think, every diabetic patient is supposed to have a retinal scan on an annual basis. There aren't enough ophthalmologists in the world to do that. And so this is a technology that can essentially help. We're seeing the same thing right now with reading mammograms. Chest x-rays are not far behind. Pathology is going to be automated in that sort of a way. That's how the clinical side of things, how they can help us. On the business side, I think there's two things that are obvious where that AI can help us. Think about, for example, making an appointment. Right now, we have 500 people who work in our call center, and they have essentially high school degrees, and they leave about every 6 months. You ought to be able to make an appointment with a tree about who you're supposed to see for what complaint that you get, and reduce the cost of healthcare that way. We have 2,700 people who work in revenue cycle. You ought to be able to read the chart, get the diagnosis, get the payer, put the bill out in about 30 seconds, or 3 nanoseconds, autonomously, and think what that would mean to the beginning of thinking about the cost of healthcare. So from both the business side of it and from the clinical side of it, I think it has enormous opportunities to help us going forward. So back to your question. Now that I babbled on here.
That's good.
I don't think that tech people really understand healthcare like we all do. And we don't understand their capabilities. And I believe that innovation happens at the borders of capabilities. And so I'm trying to bring the tech people and the healthcare people together. And one of the things we've done is we've brought 15 engineers to the Cleveland Clinic, and for a week we put them in the operating room, the emergency room, the floors, the cath labs, et cetera. And they came back, their eyes are about this big. And now they got 100 of them that are coming on a regular basis. And we want to establish the same sort of thing with docs, understand about the potential of using machine learning in healthcare. So I'm trying to figure out how we make these two worlds come together that ultimately help healthcare and help patients.
Well, it's an amazing amount of work that you've done over a career. And I went back, and our historian, Dr. Bruna Carty, who you may know, helped us find this from 1975. And the AAS rejected you. It seemed like the minimal leadership potential, unlikely to have substantial career accomplishments, and high likelihood of just becoming a hospital administrator, or worse yet, a CEO. And so we would like to make up for this. And the membership committee met, and we will make you an honorary member of the AAS. Please, thank you very much for joining us. This was a treat. We really appreciate it.